lost a bomb off the coast of America, which the U.S. government said not to worry about in the 50s and tried to cover up, was dumped in the ocean in an aviation accident, and it's still lost to this day. 100x more powerful than what was dropped in Japan. There was this other bomb that fell out of a bomb bay above the U.S. They told everyone it was fine, but later revealed that 3 out of 4 safety thingies had been actuated. Only one more and there would have been an explosion. I can't find it, but it should be in here along with other accidents, etc. There are several times in America's nuclear history where stories like this occurred. Would be crazy to think if an actual explosion would have turned the Cold War hot or humbled us as a nation enough to realize we were playing with fire and led to an earlier end to the arms race. The Goldsboro incident, January 1961. The bomber was on an exercise flying back to Seymour Johnson AFB and broke up, dropping 2 hydrogen bombs. The parachute of one caught in a tree, the other. The parachute didn't deploy and it smashed into a partially frozen swamp and sank a couple hundred feet into the muck. That one has never been recovered, the one that caught in the tree. Its detonator was one switch away from armed, and for whatever reason it didn't trip. The Circleville letters in 1976. Residents of the small city south of Columbus, Ohio began receiving handwritten, sinister and graphic letters. Each letter included secret and dark details about their personal lives. One resident received a ton of letters, accusing her of various unsavory acts. The author warned the resident that he had been keeping an eye on her home, as well as her comings and goings. The resident was horrified and tried to keep the letters a secret until her husband began receiving them. The attacks on the family continued, with large posters appearing around town spreading rumors about their 12-year-old child. One day in 1977, the husband left the house after receiving a call from who he thought was writing the letters. A few minutes later, the husband was found dead at the end of the street, dead behind the wheel. The sheriff had ruled it a homicide when he realized that a single shot had been fired before the accident. But there was no evidence that the husband was shot at the site. That the sheriff found the husband was twice the legal limit and ruled it a drunk driving accident. The letters began once again, this time accusing the sheriff of covering up the true nature of the death. The letters also accused the sheriff of mishandling an investigation into the county coroner, who had been accused of other grotesque acts. The harassment continued, this time with signs along the road, and in 1983, the original resident who had been accused of having an affair pulled over to remove the sign. During the effort to remove the sign, she discovered a box was attached and inside of it was a small pistol. The gun was part of a booby trap designed to fire when the sign was removed. Paul Freshour was arrested and given 25 years. But one small problem: the letter writing continued even after Freshour was put in jail. In a new batch of letters, the author had promised to dig up the grave of a deceased baby and mail the bones to the police in the case of another potential affair-turned-murder. Hundreds of residents continued to receive personal letters until 1994, when everything stopped. It's likely the letter sender passed away. You might try to find people in that town that passed in that time frame. That is also interestingly when the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this aired. Not that it means anything, but might scare them off. Though I do suppose they'd have started back up again. You're probably right that after 17 years, however, it was probably past. I remember seeing a video about a woman that after getting divorced started getting stalked and assaulted in her own house. Every time police would arrive, no one more than her was at the scene. Sometimes she would appear with bruises. Once she appeared with a screwdriver throughout her hand. This happened so many times that police started ignoring her calls after the investigation on her husband and on the case left no suspects. 3 months later, she disappeared just to reappear next to a highway in the middle of the desert, miles away from her house, with her hands tied. Dead. Autopsy later confirmed she was beaten to death. Creepy as shit, I know. Edit. The case is the death of Cindy James. Some of the details are different, but it's all detailed there. The Oakville blob. In 1994, there was a rainstorm in Oakville, while only the raindrops were a strange, clear substance that had the consistency of Jell-O. Lots of people experienced flu-like symptoms after coming into contact with it, and people's dogs and cats all over the city were dying. When a local hospital ran a lab test on the substance after one of the patients suggested it, it was found that whatever this mysterious rain was, it had human white blood cells in it. Sometime after that, a sample was also sent to the Washington State Health Laboratory, where it was being researched by epidemiologist Mike McDowell, after he determined that it was man-made and speculated that it was some sort of matrix for transporting viruses, bacteria. The sample suddenly went missing from the containment facility, and her supervisor known him not to ask any questions. There are no known samples of the stuff anywhere today, despite being sent to several different facilities by various Oakville residents. So yeah, I'd personally say that this was clearly some sort of bioweapon test run, but by whom? I'd like to give the US government the benefit of the doubt here and assume it wasn't us testing something like that on our own citizens, but if it wasn't, why would it have been covered up like that? And you'd think an event like this would be a lot less obscure also, even if it being a bioweapon seems super obvious. How the heck did whoever dispersed it manage to make it rain over an entire city for several days? On April 19, 1995, a truck bomb detonated outside the Alfred P. Mora Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The explosion killed 168 in what was the deadliest terrorist attack on the United States until 9/11. To date, it still remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the country. One of the lesser-known things about this is the case of the missing leg. Investigators discovered the leg laying among the rubble and identified it belonging to Lakeisha Levy. The only problem was, she'd already been buried with both her legs. She was exhumed. Her severed leg was placed in her coffin, while the other leg was taken to the FBI laboratory for identification. Since it had been embalmed, a DNA sample was unable to be obtained. The extra left leg, which had been mistakenly buried with Levy, is suspected to belong to an unidentified 169th victim, whose body had mostly disintegrated in the blast. This has led people to suspect there was an additional terrorist involved, even though perpetrators Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols had been convicted, with two others later identified as accomplices. So who was the possible additional bomber? They still remain unidentified now, 25 years after the attack. A strange but not creepy mystery: the disappearance and reappearance of Lawrence Joseph Batter. He was a cookware salesman from Akron, Ohio, who went missing in 1957. He went fishing, a storm hit, and his boat was found the next day with some damage. He was in debt and in trouble with the IRS, and his wife was about to have their third child. 4 days later, John Fritz Johnson appeared in a bar in Omaha, Nebraska. Spoiler, it's Larry Batter. Fritz was known for his wild personality. He attracted local attention for sitting atop a flagpole for 30 days to raise money for polio. He became a radio announcer and a TV sports director. He drove around in a hearse with a bar and became a minor celebrity in Omaha. By no means was avoiding attention. In 1964, a cancerous tumor was found behind his left eye and it had to be removed. In 1965, Fritz was in Chicago for a tournament, and an acquaintance from Akron recognized him, despite the eye patch, and confronted him, and then brought Batter's niece to take a look. She agreed it was her uncle and confronted him about it as well. Fritz denied it but found it humorous. Fritz's fingerprints were then matched to Larry Batter's military records and it was confirmed. Fritz Johnson always maintained he had no memory of his former life as Larry Batter. Psychiatrists examined him and believed he was telling the truth, even though he had financial reasons to assume a new identity, and the concept of someone forgetting their past and entirely constructing a different one with false memories is hard to fathom. It is also considered a possibility that the eye tumor had something to do with it. He ultimately died in 1966 from the eye tumor, and it was never determined conclusively whether he was lying or not. I am fascinated by this case especially because he had an entire change in personality, an entire life backstory as Fritz. And he made no effort to live a low profile to avoid discovery. I found this case while looking through the Wikipedia category of people who have faked their own deaths, though it's debatable if this guy should even be on there. All of which are great stories. Another one is Colonel Philip Shu's death. On April 16, 2003, 54-year-old Colonel Philip Shu left his Texas home and headed to work. 2 hours later, he was found dead in his car, an apparent victim of a car crash. The car was caved in on the driver's side and Philip suffered major head trauma as a result. He was killed instantly. This is where it gets weird. Philip had a tear in his t-shirt under his fatigues there. They could see a 6-inch vertical gash in his chest. Above the entrance to the 6 gash were at least 5 scratch marks, which the autopsy report said were both with his nipples had been removed with surgical precision. The 5th digit on his left hand had been amputated and his left ear had been lacerated down to the bone. Duct tape was dangling from both of his wrists and the top of his boots. It was ruled a suicide. Perhaps not the absolute strangest, but in March of 2020, the Windows market share for the long-discontinued Windows XP skyrocketed by about 10% in China. This spike in Windows XP use for just 1 month is for unknown reasons. Some people think the Chinese government could have been looking for security flaws in the operating system to take advantage of. After all, lots of sensitive government equipment still runs on Windows XP. The Miyazawa family. Just listened to the Case File podcast on this and it has my mind blown. Someone entered the family home around 11:30 p.m., killed everyone, ate some ice cream, took a nap, pooped and didn't flush, changed clothes and left like 8 hours after the crime. 20 years on and we don't know who or why. This dude got lost in the catacombs, and they found camera footage of his journey, but at some point he drops the camera and just starts to run. As far as I know, nobody has found out WTF happened to him. The suicide of Lavina Johnson, a black female U.S. Army private who was found shot to death inside a burning tent with a broken nose, black eyes, broken teeth, raped and acid for burns on her genitals in July 2005. U.S. Army ruled her death a suicide. There was a whole podcast episode about this on Crime Junkies and it seriously swayed me into no longer looking into going into the military. What a fucking disgrace. You can't serve your country honorably without potentially falling victim to being raped and or murdered by your own damn comrades. This infuriates me. Literally any dig site in archaeology, even the ones that are just garbage and potsherds, are fascinating if you try to really picture the people behind them, what they thought and felt. Actually, garbage probably tells you more about a people than anything else, really. Archaeology major, but my favorite is Chauvet Cave. If you have a chance, watch Werner Herzog's documentary Cave of Forgotten Dreams. I think it's still on Netflix. It has some of the most stunning cave art in the world, which almost certainly had some kind of profound significance, and we don't and will likely never know what it is. More, there's evidence that the cave was abandoned for thousands of years and later returned to, only for the returnees to continue to make paintings in the exact same style and, possibly, for the exact same reasons. There is so much to be seen in these figures. There's a portrait of an animal tossing its head that looks like one of the world's earliest explorations of stop-motion or sequential art. When I look at it, I can feel the will of the painter, who wanted so much to convey this sort of motion. There are also the footprints of a boy who arrived much later to the cave than its original users, whose marks appear to be contemporary with the paw prints of a wolf. It's hard to say now, according to Cave of Forgotten Dreams, whether they walked together, whether they walked 20 years apart, whether they were friends, or whether the wolf was stalking the boy. but I read a blog post by a professional hunter and tracker who looked at the footage of the prints from the film and said that I wonder what they were thinking, if the boy had some knowledge of what he would find there, or if he was simply exploring a cave and found some of the greatest art in human history. Until the discovery of Chauvet Cave, paleontologists were unsure as to whether cave lions had manes. On the cave walls there's an illustration of a cave lion with visible testicles and no mane. Settling that debate, 3 lighthouse workers with impeccable mustaches traveled to a remote island on December 7, 1900 for a lighthouse ship that should have lasted for 2 weeks when a boat arrived to pick them up. They were gone, no trace of the bodies, and the lighthouse was strangely locked. Not only was the setting normal, meal ready to be served, but there was no fire in the fireplace, and the clock stopped. One of the men kept a log and a diary, and he said that the seas were rough one day, but when monitored, it was actually calm. No one knows what happened to them. The Overtoun Bridge. It's a bridge in Scotland where dogs always unexplainably jump off. It's very strange and nobody knows for certain why they do this. Dogs who survived reportedly walked back up and jumped off again. They had to put up a warning sign to keep your dog. A lot of theories say maybe it's because of certain scents or animals down below, but most people have disagreed with this theory. It's fucking weird. Edit. In reality, I've done more research thanks to some comments, and it seems like people have romanticized this to make it creepier than it actually is. I don't know exactly what to believe since there's so much misinformation out there, but I'll just believe the articles who've done the most research for now. They say it was most likely not hundreds of dogs, because they can't find reports of that many jumping off like the legend says. It was only around 6. So it's likely that I was misinformed like so many other people were, and it's not actually a huge phenomenon lol. But it's still sad and a bit weird that 6 dogs jumped off. The Salish Sea Feet, or the Mad Axe Man of New Orleans. The Salish Sea Feet are the approximately 20 dismembered feet found in or around British Columbia or Washington, USA. The feet sometimes are found still inside of shoes. No one knows how they got there or where they came from. Over the course of the last 13 years, the authorities have ruled out foul play. The Mad Axe Man of New Orleans ran rampant in 1918 and 1919. He murdered 6 people, usually those of Italian descent, with axes or straight razors. In March of 1919, he sent a lengthy letter from hottest hell that was pretty nonsensical, but the most relevant paragraphs read, now, to be exact at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. There were no murders that night because every dance hall in NOLA was filled to capacity. The whereabouts of the last Gestapo chief, Heinrich Müller. The last verified sighting of him was in Berlin roughly 3 days before it fell. He had stated he knew full well what the Russians did to prisoners and he had no intentions of being captured. As chief of the Gestapo, he more than likely had access to foreign documents as well as ways to replicate them. Both the CIA and the KGB spent time looking for him, but no trace has ever been found.